I initially was just going to talk about warm and cool color, or introduce that a little bit more thoroughly, and then talk about the reason I give the assignment I'm going to be giving today. But I also thought I would introduce with a little bit more thoroughness and clarity what I mean by planar structure. So planar structure is an important concept for the kind of painting we're doing. And it's an important concept for understanding how light reveals objects within our field of vision. So we're going to be thinking about how we can use light in order to paint objects. We're also going to be thinking about how we can interpret objects in terms of their planar structure and how that planar structure is responding to the light source. So I wanted to talk about that in a little bit more depth. Okay, so again, these are, I'm just going to go through the paintings fairly quickly. I'm not going to do an in-depth critique of all of them. I will say that in general, people did a very good job. And I think people understood at least the basic concept of identifying light and shadow in terms of large masses, so a large mass of light and a large mass of shadow. So that, at least that first step, I think people understood fairly well. I will point out a couple things, a couple problems to watch out for. Is this your painting, Fatima?
Yes, this is mine.
Okay. This is a common mistake, and more than one person did it, where when looking at the cast shadow, they misperceive the cast shadow as starting from a point on the form different from where the form shadow starts. But that's just a physical impossibility. And you want to bear that in mind as you're looking at the objects we're painting. The cast shadow is going to start at the same point that the form shadow starts. Because the form shadow starts at the point on the form, or at the turn of a plane on the form, where the form turns away from the light source. And so it's also, therefore, at that point on the form, that form starts blocking light from hitting the surface, in this case, the surface that the object is sitting on. So the cast shadow is going to have to start here. Now, sometimes this happens because we misperceive this. Sorry about that. We misperceive this because the cast shadow is so narrow here. But you want to find the way the cast shadow is going to start at the same point that the form shadow starts. So this is the form shadow, this is the cast shadow. And those 2 points have to be the same. So again, for the most part, people had a good understanding of the main objective. Or, there were several objectives, but the first one was to see the large masses of light and shadow. So everybody did a strong job with that. So I think this is Sarwar's painting, is that right?
Yes, Professor.
So Sarwar did a good job of seeing the main light and shadow and then introducing the halftone. So I did want those other elements of light and shadow to be included in this painting, right? So not just the main division of light and shadow, but also the progression of light and shadow across the form, which would include halftone. So Sarwar did see that here. Now, Sarwar sent me a photograph of his setup. I didn't include it in this slideshow, but I'll just point out, and Sarwar, you can go back to the photo and look at it again, or if you have the setup still, you could see within that narrow shadow pattern, you could still make out reflected light. So you're going to want to make sure to look for all of those elements of light and shadow. So the main division of light and shadow, the form shadow, the cast shadow, all nicely painted in Sarwa's painting. Half tone, but then you're going to want to look for those more complex elements of light and shadow. This is Tyla's painting. Is Tyla here? Okay. What is this right here? Tyla, what is this right here?
I think I hear a voice, but it's just not clear if someone's speaking.
Okay. Maybe Tyler's not here, I'm not sure. Okay. Anyway, halftone in this painting too. I want to make something very clear. So the assignment was to make a black and white painting. So that means there should not have been blue used, and there should not have been a warm color used. Okay, and there's a purpose that I introduced color slowly for a reason. So that's something people want to be very conscious of. So the painting should be done with the set of colors I ask you to do them with. Okay, so I'm drawing a blank. Whose painting is this?
It's me, Melody.
Melody. Okay. So Melody's painting, I think, works well incorporating starting to incorporate the complexity of light and shadow, right? So Melody's seen light and shadow mass, form shadow, cast shadow, has started to introduce the core of the shadow and the halftone, introducing a highlight. So that's all very strong in this painting. My guess is that if we look back at some of these previous paintings, so I'm forgetting whose this is, there's a clarity of light into shadow, same thing in Sarwa's painting. There may have been, my guess is that there was a little bit more clarity of light and shadow. So I feel like possibly, and I'm not looking directly at the object you're painting from, but my guess is there was probably a little bit less of a gradation. When objects are illuminated by a single light source, there's not typically this much of a loss of the clarity between light and shadow. Sometimes you see that with very soft, indirect light coming through a window, something like that, but it's not typical anyway. One thing I think I mentioned to you, I believe I remember we had a text or an email exchange, although I'm not sure.
Yeah, text.
Okay, text. So if we think about this ellipse, we'll pretend we're drawing that ellipse. Your ellipse, the long axis of that ellipse, so the left-right axis, is at an angle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that should not be the case. When we're drawing objects in perspective, an ellipse is always going to be seen on a horizontal. So this corner of the ellipse should be raised to here, or this one should be lowered. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
It doesn't, again, I can't.
I don't understand.
Okay, so let's see this. Let's imagine a long axis on this ellipse. Okay, so remember, an ellipse is a circle seen in perspective. So if we draw the ellipse through, we can imagine the other side of the ellipse coming through like this, right? And then if we take that long axis of the ellipse, do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
Okay, so the left-right axis, that long axis. In Melody's painting, that axis is at an angle, right? So it's higher on the right than it is on the left.
Right, but it is circles, so it's impossible.
Right, it's because it's a circle, we wouldn't see that axis on an angle unless this table itself was angled, right? Unless this table had a ramp-like angle to it. But if it's a flat table, which we have to assume it is, this long axis should be drawn as a horizontal. So does that make sense for the person who asked for clarity?
I think so.
Okay, so what's not totally clear?
What axis I think you're talking about and where what it's connecting from and to.
So the axis would be the long axis from this corner to this corner.
So like the diameter of the circle?
If you
Yeah,
draw
it
a
would be
straight
similar,
line,
yeah, it would be similar to the diameter.
Okay.
That should be drawn in a perspective drawing. That should be drawn so that it's horizontal. We would never see an ellipse.
Oh, because it like kind of tilts up to the right a little bit? Is that what
Right,
you mean?
that's right. Yep,
Okay.
it rises to the right. So it's just something, and depending on what we're seeing in ellipse in relationship to, sometimes it does actually look to our eye like the ellipse is at an angle. But if you draw it that way, then you end up drawing an ellipse that appears to be sliding down an incline. So you want to draw so that it appears to be sitting flat on a flat surface. That's a drawing point.
Did you receive my revised one, Professor?
Oh, I didn't see it. I may have. Yes, I think I did actually. Okay, I thank you for
Okay.
sending that. And I'll take a look at it again. Whose painting is this? Just remind me. Again, whose painting is this?
it might be mine, but I can't tell.
Okay. Anyway, strong, good observation of light mass, dark mass, cast shadow, form shadow, core of the shadow, reflected light.
It definitely is mine. And I sent you the picture this morning, but of the
Okay.
setup, but I moved it, so I don't know if it's the same. So.
Okay, that's okay. In future paintings, Diana, I would try to get a little bit more of a transition from the shadow edge or the terminator into the halftone, right? Just lose that, soften that edge a little bit more. Try to do that a little bit more. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. I'm actually not sure if that was mine.
Whose is this?
That one's mine.
I'm sorry, I heard someone say that. Who said that?
Me, Subramani.
For some reason I can't hear you very well. It really doesn't matter. That's okay. Again, strong for the main elements we were looking for. I forget who I said it to, maybe Melody. I think maybe your transitions are a little bit too soft, right? It's a little bit too much of a gradual gradation where there should probably have been, there probably was a little bit more of a clarity of a light mass and then a clearly discernible dark mass. And the softness, the turning of the edge would happen in a more contained area along that edge. Same criticism here, same strengths, perhaps the same weakness, that there's a little bit too soft of a gradation where we lose the clarity of the light and dark shadow mass. But overall, everybody got the main elements that I was trying to get people to see. I think did a good job. Same thing is true here. Here, the transition could be a little softer. So depending on the person, we go back and forth between too much of a gradation and then perhaps a place where transitions could be softer. Scud, probably there was, I would ask you to look again at how the transitions work between core of the shadow, reflected light, and then this darkening at the edge of the form think I've seen that referred to as reflected shadow. That you want to be careful. Okay, so we have those basic elements of light and shadow, right? Which whose painting is this?
It's mine, Lena.
Lena. Okay, so we have the basic elements of light and shadow in Lena's painting. We have the light mass, shadow mass, cast shadow, form shadow. Lena did a good job finding the core of the shadow and the reflected light. So there's a phenomenon that happens when we're observing something in front of us, where along the edge of the form we'll often perceive a darkening of the form. You sometimes see it on the light side of the form as well, when you're looking at an object in front of a lighter background. So that's not happening here. Here we're looking at an object in front of a darker background. But when we're looking at an object in front of a lighter background, sometimes we'll perceive a darkening at the edge. You want to be very judicious in how you deal with that. So you don't want to overstate that darkening at the edge, because it can tend to destroy the form. So if you're working from a cone, we're going to assume that the rate of turn all the way around the cone is the same. And there are no, I'm sorry, is someone trying to say something?
No.
Okay. That there's no variation to that rate of turn. In your painting, because you overstated this shadow along the edge, it looks like there's a kind of step structure to the form. Like we come down a step and then across a step and then back over. Do you see what I mean?
Are you saying that that it flattens out the form rather than showing the curve?
It can tend to flatten it out, yes. And it looks a little bit like there are stairs here. You know, like the down part of the stair, the surface of the stair, then the down part of the stair again. So you want to be really careful in how you use these edge shadows. Often you want to just eliminate them. But we can talk about that more as we go forward. Again, another, all of the elements I think are strong in this painting. Is this Dvorak's?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I just want to talk about I had a really hard time making this painting. It was really frustrating.
You had a hard time with what?
Making the painting,
Okay.
physically more than anything else, because I don't have experience with oil paints, and it was I don't know, it felt like I was fighting with the paint, trying to get, I don't know, things to happen, to get colors to shift. If I wanted to lighten something or darken something, and to get lines straight and things like that, it was a very, I don't know, slippery medium. And I felt like I had no idea what I was doing.
Do you have experience with acrylic?
Yes.
Okay. So acrylic and oil are very different, right? And that's a very common challenge when you transition from acrylic to oil, because acrylic paint dries very quickly, not immediately, but very quickly. Oil paint stays wet for hours. And so people often do find that very challenging, dealing with the way, you put down a layer of paint and you're not able to then put another layer of paint over that without the first layer moving around. So I don't, it's, all I can really say is that, one, it's just something you get used to. I know that doesn't help much. And two, the way you figure out how to handle that is just through practice. Now I realize that doesn't help much either, me just saying that to you online. Okay, so a couple things. One, but a couple of things that are maybe more practical. If you put down a layer of oil paint and you realize, let's say it's too light or too dark, so you want to change it, So again, you can't just cover over that other layer with a new mix of paint, right? Because what happens is the wet paint underneath keeps blending into that new layer of paint you're putting down. So let's say you put down a layer of paint and you decide that it's too dark. You want to lighten it. You have a couple options. One, you can totally scrape away that first layer of paint and then wipe it down with a rag and then just start over. The other thing you can do is you can change the layer you want to change by mixing color directly into it in such a way that you're actually mixing on the canvas. So again, if you put down a layer that you decide is too dark, instead of mixing up a new batch of paint that you think is the right value, you can mix lighter paint into the layer you've already put down, which will then lighten that layer. So you're in effect mixing on the painting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's what I ended up doing.
And that's a perfectly good thing to do. The other thing, so the issue of like slippery, making straight lines, you know, that's really just practice. I can try to talk about that a little bit more today, but you know, a lot of these things, and this issue or similar issues come up in a painting class where we're all together in the studio, which is that people will have technical problems or will have challenges in making their painting. And there's really nothing, I can give some information, but there's no sort of like verbal silver bullet I can give you. Do you know what I mean? A lot of these things, you just have to work out through practice. It's like any other skill.
It's easier in a classroom because you can have, I feel like, just an easier ongoing conversation, like while you're working.
Absolutely. And that is that is, of course, the challenge and the law of online teaching. So, you know, I will try to to figure out how to deal with those challenges with online teaching. You know, probably there are some things we're just not going to be able to do. But keep asking those questions and we'll see if we can figure out some of these issues.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so overall, again, I think people did a very strong job. Just bear in mind as we're going forward, you're not only going to want to be observing lights, the main light and dark mass, but you want to try to be understanding and putting into your paintings that complexity of light and shadow as it travels across form. So the light mass, dark mass, then what happens to those light and dark masses? You want to look for highlight, halftone, core of the shadow, reflected light, occlusion shadow, or shadow accents. So you want to look for that complexity of light on these objects we're painting. Okay, so I want to introduce or talk a little bit more in depth about warm and cool color, because that's what we're going to be addressing today. So warm and cool color. So this is a classic color wheel, and we'll be talking more about color wheel later in the semester, or the color wheel. I actually do a variation on the color wheel. We're going to be doing color stars, but this is a classic color wheel. It's from a classic book on color by Johannes Itten, I-T-T-E-N. So this may be an obvious question, but what are the warm and what are the cool colors on this color wheel? So what are the warm colors?
Left side?
Yeah, the left side of the color wheel, right? So the warm colors, clearly warm from yellow to red, right? So primary yellow to primary red. And so if the warm colors are on the left side, obviously the cool colors are on the right side. So very clearly cool from, I was going to say from primary blue, but clearly cool really from blue violet to maybe green, right? Maybe, perhaps, depending on your perception, this is a little bit of an ambiguous temperature. This says perhaps an ambiguous temperature. But, warm and cool colors are fairly straightforward, right? The warm colors are the yellows, oranges, reds, or colors that tend in that direction. And then the cool colors are the violets and the blues and the greens, although greens and violets can be, between warm and cool, right? So on the color wheel, they're literally between warm and cool, right? Yellow-green is on that border. Red-violet is on the border between warm and cool. So warm and cool color, that's the basic way to think about it. But we also do want to start thinking about warm and cool color, not just in terms of these clearly identifiable, that clearly identifiable category of warm and cool, but we also want to be thinking about warm and cool in terms of relationships. So what I mean by that, we're determining warm and cool not in some kind of absolute way. In other words, we may say that orange is always warm, blue is always cool. But we want to start thinking about it also in terms of relationships. So how, the relative warmth or coolness of a color, or the relative temperature of a color, the temperature of a color relative to another color. So what I mean by that is, what we may say that green is a cool color and blue is a cool color, but which of these, if we were to just compare these two, which one is cool and which one is warm?
The blue is cool.
Most people would say blue is cool, green is warm, right? What about, it gets a little bit more ambiguous. What is a warmer blue? Is this a warmer blue? So blue-green, or is this a warmer blue? Blue-violet.
Blue-green.
You say blue-green. Blue-green. Anyone say blue-violet? Who said blue? I'm sorry?
Yeah, I could see blue violet. I feel like it depends on what they're made of.
Maybe. Who said blue-green? Was that Sarwa?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I perceive this as warmer than this, but that becomes a kind of subjective call. That's a kind of classic. I've seen that debate so many times between painters, whether this is a warmer color or this is a warmer color. That's the kind of debates painters have. So we want to start identifying warm and cool colors, both in terms of absolute categories, but also in terms of relative temperature from one color to another. So these are two paintings by a 20th century painter named Aaron Douglas. So obviously, maybe I shouldn't say that, but which painting is a warm painting and which is a cool painting?
One
The
on
one
the right.
right is warm,
Yeah.
and the one to the left is cool. But I guess only because you have them next to each other, because the one to the left could be warm as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I don't even know if I was going to bring that up, but that's a really important point. Next to each other, this is clearly a warm painting, this is clearly a cool painting. But I can imagine certain paintings. And actually, if the painting on the left that we just looked at was next to this painting, we might consider this a warm painting. That's a really important point. This is a cool painting with some warm temperatures in it. And then this is a warm painting with some relatively cool temperature in it. So, okay, so warm and cool colors in this painting are fairly clear, right? Could everybody make sure you're muted when you're not talking, just so you don't get interference? So these are two paintings by Gabriele Munter. We looked at this painting. So in the painting on the left, which is a landscape from around 1910, I think it's fairly straightforward identifying what are the warm and cool colors, right? So cool, relatively warm, clearly warm, right? There's a kind of clarity of the statement of warm and cool colors in this painting. This painting gets a little bit more complex, right? Or it gets a little bit more ambiguous. Like what is this color here? The light on her neck, is that warm or cool?
Warm.
So if we compare that to this, I think that's certainly true, right? This is warmer than this. This is warmer than this, right? But if we were to compare this yellow, and this is a kind of pale yellow, if we were to compare that yellow to this yellow, is this relatively warm or relatively cool?
Cool.
Cool, right. And the reason for that is where this artist is painting herself under the cool bluish light of a window. I'm almost certain of that, just based on the colors in the painting. And so notice how the shadow colors are relatively warm, right? So relative to the shadows, this color is actually cool compared to the reds and oranges that are coming through in the shadows. So temperature can at sometimes be very clear, warm, cool. Sometimes it becomes more ambiguous and more relational. So in other words, temperature becomes, we read temperature as being warm or cool in relationship to other colors around it. A very important thing to take note of. So warm and cool color is often determined by the temperature of the light. So these are two paintings these are two interiors. The painting on the left is by an artist named Gwen John. These are both early 20th century paintings. This might be late 19th century, I'm not sure. This painting is about 1910 by Gwen John. This painting is around 1900. This is a painting by a Swedish painter named Anna Aachen, A-A-C-H-E-N. One of these paintings has a cool light source and one has a warm light source. So if you look carefully at the light sources in these paintings, which has the cool light source and which has the warm light source?
I would say that the painting on the left has the warm light source because the room looks really golden and toasty. I feel like all the colors there kind of have a hint of like red or orange in them a little bit, while the painting on the right looks like it has more blues, and the yellow that's coming in the window looks a little more dull, more like a beige kind of creamy yellow rather than a warm kind of orange toasty yellow.
So in this painting, the orange yellow of the light you're identifying, let's say because of the color we see here on the tabletop or the color of the wallpaper?
Yeah, it looks a little warmer to me.
Okay. What about this color here? Does this suggest to you a warm or a cool light?
It kind of looks like an overcast, like maybe like a pale sky, maybe not that warm.
Yeah. What does the light hitting the floor here indicate to us about the temperature of the light? There's two things. What is the clarity of these shapes of light? What does that indicate to us about
The one to the right,
I'm sorry?
this blue one, the sun is very strong because you can see like the shadows very well.
So the painting on the right has we know the painting on the right is direct sunlight, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because of the clarity of the shapes of light compared to the clarity of the shapes of shadow. where the painting on the left, we don't have that same clarity, right? We have a more, what we would call a diffuse light. So we have a shape of light on the floor, but it's a diffuse light. It's not that kind of sharp, clear light of sunlight coming in a window. So Lena, you said, you're the one who said at first that this was the warm and this is the cool light.
Yeah, I said it, but I see what you're saying. I see the point that you're making, that the light coming in from the painting on the right is definitely stronger and seeming more like powerful. Like it's definitely warming the room more than on the left. The lighting on the left is more subtle, so there's sharper contrast and higher, like brighter highlights in the one on the right because of the lighting, right? Because it's warmer.
Yeah. So the point I want to make in this juxtaposition is this painting is a warm painting, right? Like overall, I think most of us would call this a warm painting for the reasons that Lena pointed out. I think most of us would say that this is a cool painting, again, for the reasons that Lena pointed out. But actually, if we look at the temperature of the light from one painting to the other, this painting is illuminated by a cool light source. This, as Lena said, this looks like an overcast day. So it's diffuse daylight. It's not direct sunlight. Where this is an interior illuminated by direct sunlight. So it's a warm light source. You can tell that particularly because of the way that this child's hair is responding to that sunlight. So the reason we read this as a warm painting and this is a cool painting, there are two reasons. One is that the local color temperature of most objects in this room is warm. In other words, this is a wood table, so it has that kind of warm brown color. This is yellow wallpaper, so it's local temperature. In other words, its temperature, regardless of the light that's hitting it, is warm. Where in this painting, the wallpaper is blue, right? So it's local color, but its local temperature is cool. And that's true of most of the elements in this room. And then in this painting, the cool light is actually producing relatively warm shadows. So, and that you often see that happen, where the color of the shadows will be the opposite of the color of the light. So when we see a cool light source, we often see warm shadows. When we see a warm light source, we often see cool shadows. Now that's not absolute, and there's variation within that, but it's something to look for and be conscious of. But we want to be aware not only of the local temperature of objects. So this is, again, yellow wallpaper, so we would identify that color as warm. Where this is blue wallpaper, so we would identify that as cool. But we also want to pay attention to relative warmth and cool, as we talked about in the previous slides. But also we want to pay attention to the temperature of the light. So a cool light source here, a warm light source here. The paintings I've been doing have been all warm light sources, right? I've been using that incandescent bulb. It's actually not an incandescent bulb, but it's a bulb that mimics that warm incandescent color, the color we associate with incandescent bulbs. So this Monet on the left, and this is an Alice Neel on the right. So color temperature, again, a little bit more subtle than the color temperature we were talking about initially. Like, what's the color temperature of these shadows? This is a painting called The Magpie. How would people identify that color temperature?
It'd be cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people would say it's cool, right? It's a kind of bluish violet. We would maybe call it a blue-gray, right? What's the temperature of the snow here?
It's warm.
It's subtle, but I think tending towards the warm, right? So we have a somewhat overcast day, but a day that appears to have enough warmth in the light to create the warm light on the snow. and then the cool color of the shadows. Again, the warm light from the sun is not getting to this part of the snow because it's being blocked by this wall. And so the ambient light, the light that's reflecting into this area so that we can see what's happening within that shadow, is light reflecting primarily off the sky. So it's the light reflecting off the sky is inheriting some of the sky blue and reflecting that blue back in to the color in the shadows. So what about the temperature of the shadows in this portrait?
It's warm.
Yeah, warm, right? Where we have a cool light source. This is a sitter who has been painted next to a window. And Alice Neal's paintings, for all of their awkwardness in some ways, they're always or nearly always spot on in representing the specifics of a light situation. So you can always tell the temperature of the light source in an Alice Neal painting. So we see the kind of bluish indication of the light hitting probably the windowsill or the window frame. You see the bluish temperature of the highlight on the arm of the chair, the cool cast of the skin of the sitter. And then as that form rolls around into shadow, the shadow temperature becomes relatively warm. Okay, so warm and cool color, something I want people to be very conscious of moving forward. I want you always to be identifying, you know, as we move forward in the class, I want people to be identifying the colors you're looking at in terms of their relative warmth, their relative coolness. When I say relative, I mean their temperature relative to the other colors around them. Okay, so the way we're going to be dealing with that, or first dealing with that problem, is doing a warm, cool, still life. So we're going to be using 3 colors for this painting. We're going to be using white, a color I asked you to buy called transparent red oxide. That color goes by different names. Sometimes it goes by transparent earth red, transparent earth, red oxide, so any of those colors. We're going to be using white, transparent red oxide, and black. So that's an extremely limited palette. We're going to just be looking for relationships of warm and cool. This is probably obvious, but just to make clear, we're not going to be trying to capture the colors we're looking at. We're just going to be trying to capture the relative warmth of the relative cool. So I will say, though, that it is possible to do a painting with that extremely limited palette that actually comes off as being a very rich, full range of color. So this is a painting that's at the Met in New York. So when they reopen, you can see it. It's always hung at the Met. It's a painting by Rembrandt called Lady with a Pink. It was one of my first favorite paintings when I was in high school. This painting is probably done with the palette we're using today. White, black, and earth red. That's probably all that he used. He may have used a little bit of yellow ochre, possibly. But it's possible that this painting was done with nothing but white, black, and earth red. So you can get a very rich range of color if you know how to use that limited palette. So things like this part of the portrait where you start to see that kind of bluish gray transition of the skin, that's likely done with nothing but black. It's possibly he used a bluer black than we're going to be using today. These variations of color in the skin could have been achieved with nothing but white and red, but putting the paint down in different levels of transparency. This is possibly painted with just white and red, probably a little bit of yellow in this painting, but it's possible. This is another painting that's at the Met by Picasso. It's a portrait of Gertrude Stein. Again, a painting that we certainly don't read it as a full spectrum painting, but it's a painting that convinces us in terms of its color range. And again, a painting that's nearly done entirely with white, black, and red. So we looked at this painting the other day, and obviously this painting is done with more than just white, black, and red, right? The artist would have had to have had a green pigment or a blue and a yellow pigment to get the curtain. He would have had to have those colors to get the blue of the globe. There's certainly yellow being used in the painting of these instruments, musical instruments and other instruments. There's some kind of transparent red, or probably a red that's different from earth red here. But the flesh tones in this painting are painted entirely with white, black, and red. So this painting was chemically analyzed, and the only colors that are used in the painting of the flesh was lead white, earth red, so a color similar to what we're going to be using today, and a color they called at the time bone black. It's actually very similar to what we're using, ivory black. And so the variations in the temperature of the skin, so from this paler skin here to this redder skin, that's white with red, but probably put down with different levels of transparency or opacity. So when you put down a mixture of red and white with more opaque paint, it reads as more red. When you put it down in thinner layers, it reads as more yellow. These various degrees of halftone and shadow are just made by mixing red and black. So you can get a very rich range of color with just this limited palette. Having said that, I want to be clear, we're not striving to match colors in today's painting. We're just going to be looking for on warm and cool relationships in the setup we're painting. So let me see. Okay, I'm going to share my phone and we'll move on to today's demo. All right, so this. Okay, so can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let me just show you a couple things. So I'm going to move my camera. So the first thing I will show you is my setup. So that's what I'm working from. So the image I sent you is not it's not terribly good, but it's better than not having anything, I think. And then let me just transfer the camera around, because I'm going to just remind people about what I do when I start painting every day, just so this is clear for people. So So I just want to remind people that every day I would strongly recommend everyone to do this. So at the beginning of your workday, you want to make sure to start with clean mineral spirits. So again, what I'm going to do is I used these mineral spirits yesterday. So yesterday at the end of the painting day, my mineral spirits were muddy and cruddy. But overnight, those mineral spirits have, the paint crud has settled to the bottom. So I'm going to pour out into my transfer jar. I'm going to pour out the clean mineral spirits. I'm going to take a brush. I'm going to stir up the mud at the bottom of the jar with the small amount of mineral spirits that are left. And then I'm going to take that muddy mixture, dump that out, and then put the clean mineral spirits back in here. So again, I strongly recommend people do that every day because you can use those mineral spirits over and over again. I could put a little splash of mineral spirits in there to just refresh it. But there's absolutely no reason to throw away your mineral spirits after you work. After you work on the paint. Am I recording?
What?
Yes, you're recording, Professor.
Okay, so what do I want to say? Okay, so actually before we start, before I start the demo, I want to just talk in a little bit more depth about plane. So what I mean when I talk about planar structure and how planes relate to light. So if people, I'm going to be talking about painting this object today with a warm and cool palette, observing color temperature as I paint. That's going to be what I'm primarily looking for. But throughout this semester, I'm going to be talking about planar structure. Again, that's a really important aspect of the kind of the work we're doing. So what do I mean by planar structure? So, or what is a, and I can start with asking, what is a plane? So a plane is just any flat surface, right? And I think that the mathematical definition of a plane is a surface between any 3 points. I believe that's what the mathematical definition is. So a very clear depiction of a plane would be a cube, right? So this is a cube. This is an object that's made up of 6 planes. Each of those planes having equal area, right? So 1 plane, 2 planes, 3 planes, and so on. And for our purposes, a plane, we can think of a plane as a flat surface, but we can also think of it as a surface that bends slightly or slightly bowed. So in very early writing during the Italian Renaissance, when artists were first starting to understand how to paint objects in a convincing way. Along with perspective, one of the elements of drawing and painting that was emphasized was the planar structure of objects. So artists at that time would talk about objects of nature being constructed of a series of planes. And they describe the planes as being either flat or bending. And you can think of all objects we paint as being made up of a series of planes that more or less slowly or more or less abruptly turn into one another. And we see planes because of the light that is shining on those planes. We talked about the way light reveals information to us. So I just want to illustrate that with a little bit, in a little bit more of a clear way. So I'm going to imagine a form, and let's, for the sake of our discussion today, let's imagine an eight-sided column.
Professor, you painted your canvas blue before, right?
Well, my canvas, in order to make this demonstration clear, I painted it gray.
Okay.
You should not do that for the painting you're going to be working on. It's just for this demonstration. So I'm going to imagine, again, an eight-sided column. So just so it's clear, I'm not looking at this, I'm imagining this. And then above that column, let's draw I'm going to draw a view of that column from, as if we were looking at it from above. So that's a view of that column from above. So then I'm going to imagine this column illuminated by a light source. So let's pretend the light source is similar to the light source we're using. So the light source is coming like this. So the light source is coming from above and slightly, from the left and slightly above. So then in our view of the column from above, the light would be coming this way. So this column now, because of that light source, what happens is we're going to identify the lightest part of that form as the part of that form that's most parallel to the direction of the light source. So that's the plane that is most parallel to the direction of the light source. So this plane is going to be our lightest plane on the object. We'll imagine this. Let's imagine that this I don't know. I'm sure this type of form has a name. I'll just call it an octagonal column, an eight-sided column. So that plane on the column that is most parallel to the plane of the light source is going to be the lightest plane on the column. So the light's, again, breaking across that form from the left. So the light is coming in this direction. So based on our analysis of this object, light is also going to be hitting this plane as well, right? But because that plane is not perfectly parallel to the plane of the light source, that plane is going to be a little bit lighter, a little bit darker than this plane. It's still going to be receiving light, but it's going to be just a little bit lighter because it's only getting sort of glancing light. So that this plane of the object is at an oblique, it's not turned away from the light source, but it's at an oblique angle to the light source. So this plane is illuminated, but it's not as strongly illuminated as the plane of the object that's directly facing the light source. By the way, today, to avoid the problem we ran into in the first class with
Professor, you're getting a call.
to avoid the problem we ran into in the first class with my phone overheating, I'm going to take a break in the middle of class today. I should have done that anyway, because this class should have a break in the middle of class. And I think people anyway need breaks when they're sitting in front of a computer. So we'll take a 15-minute break because we don't want to do that same problem. Okay, so we have the light hitting, we have the light side of the form. The light side of the form is any part of the form that is facing the light, is facing the light source. Whether it's facing it directly, and that plane of the form that's facing the light source directly is going to be the most strongly illuminated plane, or whether it's at an oblique angle but still catching some of the light. That's going to be a slightly darker plane. So the question now, a slightly more ambiguous question is, what would what would the value be of the top plane of this object? That would depend on on the exact angle of the light source. If I'm following the angle of my light source here, then I believe that, again, this plane is going to be the most strongly illuminated plane. This plane will be catching some light, but will be slightly darker than the strongest light source. So we see different degrees of light on an object depending on how directly the plane of the object is facing the plane of the source of light. So this plane, which is directly facing the plane of the light source, is going to be more strongly illuminated. This is going to be less illuminated. This top plane is going to be a little bit less illuminated than this plane as well. And then any plane, as we can see by this diagram, the light, again, coming from this direction, coming from the left, you can follow the rays of that light, and that light is no longer hitting the object starting at this corner, right? This corner here. It's no longer hitting the object at this point in the form where the planes of that form turn completely away from the source of the light. So that plane of the object goes into shadow. And we are able to, the reason we see different varieties of light and shadow on an object, whether it's a simple object like the geometric forms we've been working with, or a more complex object, like the fruit we're going to be working from today, or a highly complex object like a human figure. We are seeing those variations in light and shadow because of the planar structure of the object and the relationship of the direction of the plane to the direction of the light source. And then, of course, we know, as I talked about today, we know that the cast shadow is going to start at the point on the form where the object blocks light from hitting the surface the form is sitting on. So the cast shadow is going to start there. The cast shadow is going to do something like that. So this is why the cast shadow always starts where the form shadow starts. Because the form shadow is the point on the object where the form turns away from the light source, and it starts blocking light from hitting whatever object is near. And then if we were to continue our understanding of lights and shadows, we would almost certainly see slight darkening of the shadow edge because of reflected light. And then if people remember, the highlight is going to be at the point on the form where the reflection creates an equal angles back to the eye of the viewer. So the highlight on this object would be somewhere along, you would see a highlight somewhere along the top edge. You actually would see a highlight planar object that is probably along that corner. So that's the basic principle of light and shadow as it relates to the planar structure of objects. So you want to be aware of that, whether we're looking at a simple object like this faceted column, or this 8-sided column, or if we're looking at more complex objects like the still life we're going to be painting today. So for the
I've got a question
Sure.
about
Yeah, I should ask. Go ahead.
why the shadow fades out in the way that it does. Just if there's a way that could be expressed.
So for example, why does the cast shadow get softer as it goes backwards in space? Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I guess that's just because there's more and more ambient light filtering in or reflecting back in, where the form of the object is not allowing much ambient light to get in here.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I'm not sure I know the mechanics of that to explain it clearly. So that's a really good question. But just thinking about the properties of light, as we get further away from the object, there's more possibility for a greater range of angles of ambient light to be reflecting in. Right, where right here along, right at the edge of the object, there's no way for ambient light to reflect in from this way, right? There's some ambient light reflecting in like this, where back here, you have more possibility of ambient light reflecting from multiple directions, which is softening the light. The other, I mean, and then of course, so the other way we can think of a cast shadow is a cast shadow, like if we draw a small version of our object. So the light is coming something like this. And in theory, we're going to be able to determine where the cast shadow is, because the cast shadow is going to, we would be able to mathematically figure that out. It's going to end where the light, where the light is no longer being blocked. There's an angle between the object and the surface that's created by the direction of the light. And where that's no longer being blocked, we're going to have light, right? And so the further we get away from the object, I think there's just more opportunity for light to reflect in there and soften that shadow. Does that make sense?
Kind of. I think I'm.
Yeah, but you know, that's a good question. And my knowledge of light, it doesn't come from studying the physics of light in depth. My knowledge of light, and for that matter, I have to admit my knowledge of color comes from working with it as a painter. So I can't answer your question with 100% confidence right now as to why that light, why the cast shadow gets softer. But I do know some people who can answer that question, so I'll find out for you. I'll try to get a more precise technical answer to that.
Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, so on to our, still left, actually, what time is it? 10:30. Okay, why don't we do this? Let's give my phone a break. Again, I want to avoid what happened on Tuesday, and let's give ourselves a break. So we'll take a 15-minute break, and we will pick this back up. I have 10:32, so let's pick it back up again at 10:47, okay?
Okay. Sure.
Okay, is everybody back?
Yep.
Okay, everybody can see my setup?
Yes.
So as I said, we're going to be doing a warm, cool still life today. And so we'll be using white, black, and transparent red oxide or something similar. Does everybody have that color?
I have.
Did anybody not able to find that color?
It was on the list, right?
It's on the list. Yeah.
Okay, so I got every color on the list.
I'm still waiting for all the colors, so I should be getting it. And if I don't get it today, I should definitely have it through the weekend. So I should have it. So I should be able to get it done.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so transparent red oxide is. We'll talk more about these different kinds of colors. Transparent red oxide is a red that's often referred to as an earth red. And when a color is referred to as an earth color, it literally means it comes from the earth. So earth reds are made from clays. So transparent red oxide out of the tube looks very dark. We mix a little bit of white with it and we see more of that kind of earth red hue. There's a whole range of earth colors. So there's a color called Venetian red, which isn't quite as dark when it comes out of the tube. We're not going to be using that today, but so there's a whole range of earth colors. When you see red in old paintings, it's usually an earth red. Just treated in different ways to get different effects. I'm sorry.
Selena's waiting.
Okay. Tyler, can you hear us?
Professor, for Zoom, if you make other people co-host, then we can admit people. Like,
Oh, that's right. How do I do that again?
so you have to go to a participant,
I have to go to what?
participants, yeah,
Okay.
and you see you click the name and you see the more.
Yeah.
Then you can see. Oh no, not here. But maybe you can see. You can see. You can make a co-host. From my view, I cannot see.
Yeah, I actually don't see that, but I know what you mean. I've seen people do it before.
Yeah, I did because I work for a DOE, so I have a Zoom link. So I do sometimes.
Huh. It's not coming up right now on my, I don't know why. I'll have to figure that out. I'm not going to figure it out now, but I will.
You have to set it up possibly in the beginning when you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll figure that out, but thanks for pointing that out, Selena.
Yeah.
Tyler, can you hear us?
Hi, yeah, I'm sorry. I've been trying all morning trying to get into the class. I was so like not knowing what to do.
Okay, do you have the email, the cell phone list that I sent out?
I don't have the cell phone list, but I have the email with your number and
Okay, check your emails. I sent out a cell phone list with everybody's or several people's cell phone on it, so you can text them if you're not able to get in.
okay.
Okay.
And I'm gonna also email you with my number. I'm not sure. Oh wait, you have it.
Oh yeah, I have your number, so I'll add you on if that's okay.
Okay, no problem. Sorry, you guys finally see my face. I'm sorry, I haven't been like in the class as much.
It's okay. All right, so okay, so I'm not gonna use yellow ochre today to draw. I'm just gonna draw with the transparent red oxide. So again, referring to if you could refer to the image I sent to everybody as the source, that would be helpful. So, okay, so before I get into mixing, observing color temperature, and then mixing the appropriate hue to approximate the color temperature, I again want to talk a little bit about drawing, because drawing is not necessarily something everyone has a lot of experience with. So we're drawing or I'm drawing today this piece of fruit, right? So this is an Asian pear. And by the way, so for the next still life that I'd like people to do over the weekend, based on this demo today, I'd like you to find a piece of fruit, an organic object. A piece of fruit is the easiest thing to use. And try to get a piece of fruit that doesn't have a lot of variation in its surface color. So if you look at the image I sent you today of this Asian pear, it's basically a kind of pale yellow all around. An orange would work well, a lemon would work well, something like that. Try to avoid apples that have a lot of striations of color or a lot of variations of color. You probably don't want to use a peach. Use something that has one consistent color all around. It's the easiest way to do it. Okay. So something I just want to say about drawing. So I mentioned when we drew the cone the other day that I was setting up what I call construction lines. And I'm doing the same thing in blocking in the drawing of this pear, or this Asian pair. So what I'm doing is I am not just looking at that object and then sort of randomly like bending a contour in some way that approximates the shape of that pair. Instead, I'm observing on that object the way I can think of the contour as constructed of a series of straight lines or tight arcs. So an arc, something like this. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to, if I want to make that contour convincing, a really important part of making a convincing contour is noting the high points on the contour. So in other words, the points on the contour where it is furthest away from the central axis. And I want to be very accurate about the angle relationships between those points on the contour. So by observing the high points on the contour and the angle relationships from one high point to the next, I'm able to ultimately set up a series of relationships that will lead me to a much more convincing organic contour than I'm able to get by just sort of tracing around with that kind of like bent wire contour. Eventually I'm going to modify that locked-in contour I have so that it reads as completely organic. But the first thing I want to do is just note the way the contour can be understood as a series of straight lines. Again, straight lines or tight arcs in relationship to one another. The other thing that allows me to do is it allows me to start to understand the planar structure of the object. So I just talked about planar structure, right? So if we revisit this painting, so I talked about the way we can understand form as a series of planes in relationship to one another, or a series of planes in relationship to a light source. So we have the light plane, the middle tone plane, and the dark plane. And when we observe that and paint that, we start to construct a convincing sense of planes turning in different directions in space relative to the direction of the light source. So if we note the contour of this object, because this is a clearly geometric object, we have this clearly geometric contour, and the contour itself shows us how that object turns around in space, right? Because the contour is moving up at an angle, and then horizontally, and then backwards at an angle, right? So that contour traces out the way that object moves through the perspective space. I can also find that in an organic object, although it's not quite as clear. But I still want to find the way the contour reveals to me the way this object is moving through the space. So if I look, and if people can look at the reference photo I sent you, if I look at the Asian pair, the bottom contour, so the contour from about around this point on the pair to this point, let's say I draw that just by absolutely copying the curves on the line.
Is there a way that we could see the pair, or did you send us a picture?
I did. Yeah, I sent everyone.
It's in your email.
Yeah, I sent it as an email.
Oh, okay, I see.
Okay. So if I were to draw the bottom contour of that contour, I mean the bottom of that, the contour, the bottom of that pair, I would maybe wrap the bending line around something like this. But if I really look carefully at a geometric simplification of that contour, I'll note that from this point, from that contour to this point, I have a relatively straight line. And then again, from this front corner of the contour to this point here, I have another relatively straight line. And that, the contour constructed that way shows me the way the planes of that pair face in one direction here. So the planes on the pair are facing a direction so that those planes are moving that way in space. And then at this corner here, where the contour changes direction, the planes are moving this way in space. So I can use the contour, a carefully considered geometric simplification of that contour, to start helping me clearly describe the way this complex organic form is moving through space. So I'm going to simplify that contour into a series of straight lines. Again, looking very carefully at how each of these high points relate to every other high point. And I can slowly make that contour more complex until it successfully communicates the organic complexity of that object. Okay, so I have this contour locked in. Now I'm going to start to ask myself, what's the more complex information I can start to include? Okay, so the first thing I'm going to draw is, I will indicate the cast shadow. So I have a relatively small cast shadow. At least it's smaller than the cast shadow that was cast by the comb we worked from Tuesday. These are cast shadow shape, something like this. And then I'm going to draw, just like I did the other day, I'm going to draw the point behind the pair, where the surface of the table transitions to the wall behind it. Okay, so then now I'm going to carefully place the dimple where the stem emerges. And I'm going to resist going for observing any detail on that dimple where the stem emerges. So I'm just going to place a point on the pair where it sits. And again, I'm going to be very carefully looking at point-to-point relationships. I'm going to place that dimple. I'm going to be carefully looking at the angle relationship.
Professor, it froze.
Okay,